Hi everybody, welcome to Unit 5, Philosophy 1200. Today should be Monday, April 13th. Um, so yeah, we just had our last exam. We're starting a brand new unit this week, and then we'll also be starting a new unit next week. So we have 2 regular weeks of class left, and there's 2 more things I want to go over. The entirety of this week will be about informal fallacies, which I think is a lot less mathematical, a lot less formal. It should be an easier concept for you guys to grasp, understand, and practice. In fact, it probably will take less practice. And then with our last week, I want to introduce just a few more things with proofs. And that will just build on the stuff we've already been doing with proofs. So for a week, proofs are going to go away, but please don't forget anything about them because they aren't going away for long. Both of these units will be the entirety of our last exam, which will take place on Friday of finals week. After our experience with this last exam, I'm still on the fence as to how the format for the last exam will be, but know that it's just going to be Unit 5 and it's just going to be Unit 6, proofs and informal fallacies. So that's sort of the roadmap going forward. I hope it's not too much. Again, we're going to go pretty slow. I already cut a bunch of content from what we would be doing normally in this class, but you know, if people aren't grasping the content, I will definitely curve the exam to your guys' abilities. So don't be too worried about all the content we still have to do. Alright, so let's jump into informal fallacies. We're going to learn a bunch of different kinds of fallacies and learn how to point them out in real life. Arguably, this is the most useful unit in the whole class. So, informal fallacies. We've already gone over some fallacies before, but just to reiterate, fallacies are familiar arguments that demonstrate poor reasoning. They're bad arguments, but they're bad arguments not because they're ineffective or unpersuasive. And what we're going to learn in this unit is, in fact, that powerful people use fallacies all the time to sort of persuade us or manipulate us. And in fact, I think most of us are guilty of using fallacious arguments, at least maybe on a weekly basis. But what's important is that we recognize when we are using fallacious reasoning and when we're not, because relying on fallacies to make our points can often alienate us from other people, make us demonstrate our points in a sort of dishonest way, and I don't know, get people to believe us with values other than sort of objective reason, which I would like to think is a good thing. Objective reason, that is. So, there are 2 kinds of fallacies. There's formal fallacies and then there's informal fallacies. We've already gone over 2 formal fallacies, and formal fallacies are just pretty much any invalid argument form. Sometimes they have names, sometimes they don't. So the fallacy of affirming the consequent, FAC, and fallacy of denying the antecedent are 2 examples of formal fallacies. So these are wrong, these are bad arguments, fallacious arguments, because of their form, because of their structure. If you remember, FAC is just modus ponens, but kind of screwed up, such that it's not valid. So anytime you use FAC, you have no reason to accept the conclusion based on the truth of the premises. That's what makes it a bad argument. So it's a bad argument. It's a fallacy because it's a bad argument, and it's a bad argument just by looking at it, regardless of what it's about. So informal fallacies, on the other hand, oftentimes are valid in terms of their form or structure, but what makes them fallacious, what makes them bad, is what's going on inside of the argument. What terms are being used, how the argumentation is being done, what the meaning of the argument is. So it makes them a lot harder to sort of point out in natural language, but that's also why they're so effective in persuasion, because they can often fly under the radar, especially if you're a particularly good wordsmith. So the biggest takeaway from this unit is that it's going to be common that you might accept or be persuaded by a fallacious argument, and that's okay. And if you want to be a lawyer or a politician or a tabloid news person, um, learning these fallacies is going to is going to help you in your career. Um, but what's important to know is that when you use them, when you appeal to, or when you make an argument to get someone to believe your conclusion, you're not appealing to their sense of reason. You're appealing to something else. I think that's important because I think we could have an honest moral conversation about whether or not that's right or just or something we want, especially in a democratic society. Yeah. So fallacies are really important to know about because to me, they're sort of a bullshit detector. Fallacies are a sort of very common form of bullshitting. All right. So we're going to learn, I think, around 20 fallacies. So it'll be useful for you to sort of compile a list in your notes. And I've separated them by these sort of headers, and there's going to be a couple of these. One note before we go on, every logic book has both a different amount of fallacies and sort of different names for them. A lot of them have the same name no matter what, but there's a lot of ways to sort of cut up what the informal fallacies are. There's no Bible of logical fallacies. Philosophers agree about a lot of them. They don't agree about all of them. So the ones that I'm going to tell you about, I think are fairly commonly agreed upon, are fallacious, but they may not be known as this name in other places. So a Google search for any of these will probably bring up good examples, but they also might bring in sort of tangential examples. Like the appeal to emotion, as we'll see, can be split up into 5 other fallacies if you want. The appeal to emotion is a sort of umbrella term, and that may apply to these other fallacies. But that doesn't mean that they're any less useful or important to know. This is just how I split them up, but I don't think it's going to detract from your learning of them. All right, so these are the fallacies of distraction. You can imagine what that's going to entail. So the first one is the appeal to emotion. Again, you might be able to intuit what this one's about. So the appeal to emotion is when any argument tries to get you to accept the conclusion based on appealing to your emotion. So if it appeals to your sense of fear, sense of desire to fit in, sex, pride, or pity, these are all appeals to emotion. So this is seen in advertisements and politics all the time. There's plenty of advertisements out there who have really attractive people in it, and thinking about the appeal to emotion, the appeal to emotion makes you wonder why that might be. Well, attractive people are nice to look at, and usually advertisements exist to sell a product. Well, if I'm looking at good-looking people, I might be more willing to buy that product. The reasoning is as simple as that. But what makes that a fallacy is that they're not making a case for that product based on the merits of the product. They're using attractive people to sell me on it. They're appealing to my sense of aesthetics or my sense of sexual attraction in order to make their point. That's what makes it a fallacy. There are other examples too. Here in politics, Make America Great Again. That's a sort of loaded slogan. What does that mean? Is that making an argument? Well, it is. But it's making an argument based on a sense of national pride. This slogan appeals to a sense of national pride, especially in the use of the word again, because it's appealing to especially older Americans who can remember that this sort of time before when things were good and America was on top. It's trying to make a case an appeal to those Americans' nostalgia for that time, and that's what makes it an appeal to emotion, and that's what makes that those sort of appeals should sort of perk our ears up a little bit and be more vigilant as to what might come next if that comes up in an argument. Here's another example. You should give me a good grade because I just lost all my money in a multi-level marketing scheme. So that's an appeal to pity. You know, something really bad happens. I really need you to help me out. If you see someone who's on the side of the road panhandling, usually they have a sign that says, "Hey, I just lost my job," or, you know, "I'm a veteran," or, you know, "I have kids to feed," things like that. These are all appeals to your sense of pity. But what's interesting about this is, you know, I don't know, especially panhandlers, it's hard to say that they're being sort of nefarious in asking for money or appealing to pity, or this person asking for a better, you know, a better grade. Appeals to pity, I think, happen all the time, and justifiably so. As opposed to, you know, this political argument where you know, you might say there's a moral problem going on. An appeal to pity you could very well characterize as just being a human being. But what's important to know, again, is, you know, if you give me this argument and I give you a better grade, I have to admit to myself that I didn't give you the better grade because you made a good argument. I gave you the good grade because I feel bad for you, or I, you know, want to do you a favor. That's the importance of recognizing the appeal. And then our last example, from straight out of a teen movie in junior high. You don't smoke, all the cool kids are doing it, therefore you should smoke. So that's an appeal to emotion because it's appealing to this, whatever the cool kids are, and you want to be one of the cool kids, therefore you should do what the cool kids do. That's not making a case as to why you should be like the cool kids or anything like that. That's just telling you it's appealing to your sense of wanting to fit in, and that's what makes it an appeal to an emotion. So as we're starting to see with these fallacies, sometimes it's hard to just, you know, recognize that there's a fallacy there. But once you sort of get the hang of these, you'll start to see them everywhere, which might, you know, keep you up at night, but hopefully will make you better at reasoning, better at decision making, and better at making sort of informed decisions. All right, so that's the appeal to emotion. The next one is the appeal to force. So this is in Latin the argumentum ad baculum, which I believe is translated as appeal to the stick. So this is just any time when you use force or intimidation or coercion in order to get somebody to do something. So normally in this class, we would want to give good, sound, valid arguments for people to accept our conclusion, but the appeal to force is, you know, screw that, accept my conclusion or I'll beat you up. That's the appeal to force. So what's important to note is that it's not always physical harm, but blackmail is an appeal to force, you know, loss of job or social status. All these sorts of coercive things are an appeal to force. What is and is not coercion is hotly debated in moral philosophy and political philosophy. But if we can determine that something is coerced, we can likely say that there was an appeal to force there. So here's an example out of elementary school. The schoolyard bully tells you to give him your lunch money, and if you don't, he'll beat you up. Well, he's not giving you a good argument as to why he should give you money. He's just threatening you. That's an appeal to force. Here, some sort of realpolitik. Accept our demands or we will invade. Well, you're not really, that's not an argument as far as we're concerned. That's, you have to do what they say or fight a war. And then another example is any sort of quid pro quo, this for that, usually within a power imbalance. Again, that's a sort of transaction that occurs not because of good reasoning, but usually it's a sort of blackmail situation. So that's the appeal to force. Usually pretty easy to tell if something is an appeal to force. All right, the next one is a straw man. Some of you may have heard of this one before, but the straw man or the straw person is committed when one fails to attack another's argument, but instead attacks a weak caricature of it. So, think of the metaphor of, okay, instead of attacking your argument, I'm going to build a scarecrow and then attack that instead. That's the straw man. I'm not attacking your argument. I'm building a weak version of it that I made out of straw. Yeah, and sometimes this is done intentionally. I think in politics a lot of times this is done perfectly intentionally, but I think we might do this to each other a lot of times just because we aren't good at representing each other's arguments. That's a sort of skill that's sort of difficult to cultivate. So I think there's plenty of times, I think, in our personal interactions where we'll accidentally construct a straw man and tear somebody's position apart just because we don't understand it. Chances are, if you can tear somebody's, usually especially a moral, political, or aesthetic disposition or belief, if you can tear that down really easily, you should always think about whether or not what you're tearing down is a straw man. And yeah, this is seen plenty of times in politics because if you can't really see this stuff, if you don't know about fallacies and you don't know that people might be doing this, I don't know, it's easy to get caught up into somebody tearing down a straw man, especially if that straw man is a position that you really do not care for. So here's one talking about abortion. Say that a politician is talking about their opponent. Well, my opponent is a proud supporter of abortion. Why would you want to vote for somebody who wants to kill babies? Well, this is a straw man. Why? Because of this second sentence here. Most supporters of abortion would not characterize their position as wanting to kill babies. So if you're characterizing their position that way, you're building a straw man, because now you're trying to make the conversation about killing babies and making that a stand-in for a hopefully robust defense of abortion. But that's a straw man. And we can imagine plenty of sort of political contexts where this would fly and perhaps be successful. There are many, I think, contexts where this would go without report. But it's important, I think, for us, regardless of your position, to see this as a straw man. And we could easily flip the positions here. Another example, Alex thinks that they should consider cutting, or that we should consider cutting funds to Medicaid, and Tony characterizes her position as wanting the poor to suffer. If we're charitable, if maybe we know Alex, maybe we don't, but giving her the benefit of the doubt, we might not think that she wants the poor to suffer. Cutting funds to Medicaid does not necessarily entail wanting the poor to suffer. So Tony is constructing a straw man and attacking Alex for it. She might have a more robust argument for her cutting of funds to Medicaid. So that's a straw man. All right, the next one is a red herring. It's a little odd, but again, very common, especially in politics. So this is when someone is having an argument and they rapidly change the subject to another topic. And I like this quote from another logic textbook. One commits the red herring fallacy because one is not comfortable arguing about a particular topic on the merits, often because one's case is weak. So instead, the arguer changes the subject to an issue about which he feels more confident and makes strong points on the new topic and pretends to have won the original argument. If you watch any sort of morning shows or cable news or interviews on the internet with politicians, if the reporter or whoever, the moderator, asks them a question on something that they know they don't have a strong position about, they'll try to pivot and talk about something else. In that case, they're using the red herring, and often to their political benefit. If I was their advisor, I would advise the same exact thing. Yeah, and some people call this sort of whataboutism, because instead of talking about the thing, you say, well, what about this other thing? I've seen political people, activists commit this fallacy all the time. So yeah, it's very common. One way to think about this in sort of metaphorical terms is that think of like a really stinky fish that's like brightly colored. So when you commit the red herring, you're pulling a really stinky, brightly colored fish out of your pocket and you're waving it in front of your opponent so as to distract them. That's the red herring. All right, the next one is the very common argumentum ad hominem. And this translates to argument against a man. And this comes in 4 forms, and we need to learn all 4. But broadly, this occurs when you attack the person giving an argument rather than the argument itself. In logic, we really want to be able to separate someone's argument from the person giving an argument. We can always come back and examine the connection in other sort of philosophical contexts. It's not necessarily true that there is no necessary connection between someone giving an argument and the argument itself, but it's extremely important that we be able to at least separate them and examine each on its own merits, both the person and the argument. Ad hominem is when we fail to do that entirely. So the first one is ad hominem abusive, and this is just when we attack the person themselves. So if you say that, you didn't come to class because I'm ugly and stupid, you're committing an ad hominem attack. You're not giving me an argument as to why you didn't come to class. You're just being mean to me, and that makes me sad. Circumstantial is similar, but it's not when you attack the person directly. You attack them by means of what they do or what they're associated with. So if you say, well, Nick just wants to save his job because he's a philosophy teacher, that's why we shouldn't listen to him. You're committing an ad hominem circumstantial attack because you're not addressing maybe arguments that I've given as to why philosophy is important or anything like that. You're just attacking me and what I'm associated with. This is often seen, I think, a lot of times in a campus context where someone controversial comes to campus. And if we say that, well, this speaker is racist, therefore we shouldn't believe anything they say, or we shouldn't listen to anything they say, that may well be true. That person may well be racist. Their argument may well have racist implications. But the ad hominem circumstantial tells us that, well, when we say that, we're not actually attacking what the person says. We're just attacking the person. So, if you want to protest someone who's controversial, you should probably do both. You should have an answer for their argument, and you should probably have an answer for them. Otherwise, you might commit the ad hominem circumstantial. The other one is tu quoque. This is also very common. This is when you call someone a hypocrite as a reason to not accept their argument. This is the sort of do as I say, not as I do sort of argument. And tu quoque means you too. So if I tell you to study hard and do well on the exam, and you find out that, well, I don't study at all and I've failed my last 3 exams, and you use that as justification to not study and fail the next exam, then you would be committing this fallacy, because it's perfectly possible that what I told you was good advice and a good argument. The fact that I'm giving it, the fact that I'm a hypocrite, doesn't have anything to do with the merit of the argument I made. So if you attack me on the basis of my argument and use that as a means to dismiss my argument, you're committing the tu quoque. That's a little bit difficult for people because I think we often take hypocrisy very seriously, and I think we should. But again, the ad hominem, the lesson of the ad hominem is that it's necessary to be able to divorce someone's argument from the person giving the argument. And then the last one is poisoning the well. And this occurs pretty much anytime you attack a person before they have presented their argument as well at all. So say, we're all gathered for the first day of class, and I haven't shown up to class yet, and somebody comes in and is like, "Hey, this guy Nick, he sucks. He smells, and he's an awful guy. You shouldn't listen to him at all." That person doing that is poisoning the well, because I haven't given an argument. I haven't, been able to present myself. I haven't even been able to make a claim, and already I've been attacked, and any position I might give might be attacked. So that's poisoning the well. It's not of the four. It's probably the least common, but it's important to know about. So that's ad hominem. Here's a couple of examples you can check out in your own time. One comes from politics, the other one comes from professional wrestling. All right, so now we're on to the next batch. I'm talking a lot. And these are the fallacies of weak induction. All right, so we have the argument from ignorance. So this is when someone infers a conclusion from a lack of information. They infer knowledge from ignorance, which, if we know the meaning of those terms, we might find to be dubious. So this usually comes in two forms. Either it comes in the form, nobody can explain X, therefore my theory of X is true, or it comes in the form of, nobody can prove that I'm wrong about X, therefore I'm right about X. Both of these are examples of fallacious reasoning and the argument from ignorance. And this is pretty much how conspiracy theories work. They take a lack of evidence and they use that as justification to entertain these other theories. I'm not a big fan of conspiracy theories. I think some are more justified than others, but there is something to be said that, especially the more extreme ones, almost always commit the argument from ignorance. So here's an example that I see on Twitter all the time. We didn't disprove that Donald Trump colluded with Russia, so he definitely did. So that's the argument from ignorance, because as far as I know, it's not the job of the federal investigators to disprove stuff. It's their job to prove stuff. So we can't infer that he colluded with Russia from a lack of information that he colluded with Russia. We can only make that inference if we have evidence, not a lack of evidence. A lot of my friends from home are into crystals. I don't understand it, but they tell me it works, and I think about this every single time I go back home. So here's a scenario. There's no evidence to suggest that amethyst doesn't help you sleep. That's why my mattress is filled with the stuff. Well, it may well be true that there's no evidence to suggest that amethyst doesn't help you sleep. But that doesn't mean that it has any relationship at all to sleep or any other sort of natural process. It may well be the fact that amethyst is just a pretty rock. But yeah. And then this last example, again, reminds me of home. Historians and archaeologists disagree about how the pyramids were built. Therefore, it was probably aliens who did it. So history and archaeology is really hard, and coming to consensus and certain knowledge about that stuff is extremely hard. But that doesn't mean that we get to come up with our own outlandish theories when there's disagreement. Chances are there are much more plausible theories as to how the pyramids were built than aliens. I might be able to be convinced that aliens did it, but it would take a really strong argument. And I think a lot of the arguments that are popular that are made commit this fallacy. All right, next one is appeal to inappropriate authority. So this is one of my favorites. This is when one tries to justify their argument by consulting an inexpert authority. And this is difficult and uncommon because I think it's really hard to tell who is really in the best position to know things and who's in the best position to sort of lend credence to our arguments. I just defended my master's thesis and I wrote about this sort of thing. How are we supposed to know when people are credible and how are we supposed to know who experts are when we don't know shit? When we don't ask those questions, we might make this fallacy. So I would like to think that I'm an appropriate authority on philosophy and logic. I've spent a lot of time studying that stuff, and I have some informed opinions about it. But I'm definitely not an appropriate authority on biology and film. I haven't spent much time with either of those. I don't have good taste. I don't know what cells are. Don't ask me about these things, because if I'm responsible, I'll tell you that I don't know. If I'm irresponsible, I will lie or tell falsehoods without knowing. So if you were to appeal to me for your film recommendation and justify that to your friends, you're committing the appeal to inappropriate authority. So this happens all the time in arguments about values. So here's an example talking about Avengers Endgame. A whole lot of people saw it, therefore it must be a great film. No, that's the appeal to inappropriate authority. The movie-going audience are not necessarily experts on what good film is. You might be able to make that argument. You might be able to, maybe a sociologist can say, well, there's high correlation between movie-going audience and quality of film. But, full stop, you can't say that sort of thing, because it's an appeal to inappropriate authority. I think film critics, maybe people in the film industry, people who have seen a lot of films, I don't know, might be in a better position to evaluate whether a film is good. Another example seen in politics, Barack Obama's popularity is really high. He must have been a good president. Again, it's the same sort of thing where we're appealing to this time the sort of voting masses in order to justify our argument. And that's fallacious because we can't be certain that the voting population is an expert on politics or economics or all the sorts of things that go into this value judgment of good president. They might have opinions about it, but they might not have knowledge about it. That's what the appeal to inappropriate authority asks us to distinguish. Then the last one, my mom says I'm the best artist in the world. My art teacher is clearly mistaken. So here I'm holding up my mother as the ultimate authority on whether I'm a good artist, and that's probably unwise because, she doesn't know a whole lot about art, and she loves me a whole lot, so she's just going to support me. That doesn't mean that I'm a good artist. The art teacher is probably in a better position to know than my mother about who is a good artist. So yeah, that's the appeal to inappropriate authority. Oh yeah, and then when I was teaching this class last semester, one of my students asked me about mansplaining and whether that was an example of the appeal to inappropriate authority. And I thought that was a good example because I think in mansplaining, the phenomenon, which is usually characterized as when predominantly men explain things to women that women already know, I think that phenomenon happens because men, likely through their socialization as men, interpret themselves as having greater authority and greater expertise than any sort of woman, or woman sort of full stop. So yeah, mansplaining I think could be interpreted in this context as you're the man doing the mansplaining thinking that they know more than the woman that they're talking to. So I thought that was an interesting example and a good way to sort of cross over into feminist philosophy with our humble logic class. All right, we got two more, and then we're done, I promise. This one, probably one of my favorites of the bunch, post hoc ergo propter hoc. If anybody speaks Latin, you might be ahead of me. It means after it, therefore because of it. And you could characterize this as the fallacy of false cause. So this happens because justifying a causal connection is like really hard. And just because something happened doesn't mean it was, just because something happened before another thing doesn't mean it was the cause. It may well have been a coincidence. If any of you have taken a social science class, you might know the phrase correlation does not equal causation. That's the same exact thing. Just because something happened after it doesn't mean it happened because of it. So this was thrown out a lot in the 80s because AIDS affects largely homosexual men. It must be because of their lifestyle. This was proven to be false. It took a while to be proven false, but it was extremely influential with people for at least that short time, and I would think it's still influential with some people today. Another one that our president loves to talk about, unemployment has been low ever since the president took office, therefore the president has improved the economy. Well, it may well be true that the president has improved the economy, especially, it may well be true that Donald Trump has improved the economy, but from what I know about the economy, it's very difficult to measure economic performances and figure out what caused those economic performances. So saying that everything has been good just after a new president came to town is totally fallacious reasoning for this reason. You need much more details. You need much more specific things to root down the causes. As much as Donald Trump might want to take credit for the economy, it's really not that simple. And then here's an example. You can look at it in your own time from The West Wing, which is an enjoyable show. All right, and then our last one, no, we have two more. I suppose I lied on the last slide, is the slippery slope. This is also about causes and bad causal assumptions. So slippery slope usually takes the form of, if we don't accept thing 1 and thing 2, then we'll end up with this extreme thing Y and extreme thing Z, and we really don't want those things. It's a large causal chain where someone is saying, well, if we accept the first link in the chain, we're definitely going to get the last link in the chain. And that's fallacious because in order to justify a causal chain, you have to justify each step in the causal chain. And the slippery slope does nothing to do that. It usually relies on sort of people's fears or people's instincts about a thing. Maybe they're pre-existing biases in order to sort of shut down that reasoning part. And this is, again, often seen in politics and appeals to our resistance to change. I remember before same-sex marriage was legal, especially right-wing politicians would use this argument all the time. If we legalize same-sex marriage, then polygamy will be legal next. That's the slippery slope argument. And that's a fallacy because there's no necessary connection between same-sex marriage and polygamy. If, we have two completely separate arguments about that, and they affect, completely different people and are just sort of different things. So it's not reasonable to think that if we accept the one, that we have to get the other. That's the slippery slope. All right, last one, I promise. Hasty generalization. This is when we inappropriately infer a general conclusion from too little evidence. We do this all the time. I do it all the time because coming up with the appropriate evidence is really hard, especially if you aren't good at reading science journals or figuring out what scientists think, or consulting experts or anything like that. So an example, it snowed yesterday, therefore climate change can't be real. That's a hasty generalization because you're taking one instance of weather to infer about climate. Anyone who knows about weather science or anything like that would be a red flag to them. Climate takes years worth of data in order to make estimates about, let alone climate change, and even more so, man-made climate change. So this example right here is straight up hasty generalization. I've heard this one plenty in my time as a teacher. I failed the first exam, therefore I'll surely fail the whole class. Definitely not true. Plenty of people have failed the first exam and come back to pass the class. This is usually motivated by pessimism, but it's still a hasty generalization. And then this one is, cute. Every baker I've known, I've ever known was a criminal, therefore all bakers are criminals. I think that's clearly wrong, clearly fallacious reasoning. But what's interesting about this argument is this is sort of the form of a lot of bigoted statements. Every person X I've ever known has done bad thing Y, therefore all persons X do bad thing Y. It's easy for us to take our personal experience as the sort of end-all be-all of knowledge, but the hasty generalization asks us to consider, well, maybe our experience of the world is in contradiction or in contrast with empirical data. So it's important when we make these sort of generalizations that we consult more information, that we look outside of ourselves and our environments and see what's really going on in the world, which is really hard. So I can understand why this gets committed all the time. So yeah, and that's what I just said.